I found a corpse with two completely different pasts engraved on its body, and when I discovered the truth, I was left speechless. I am Dr. Ricardo Valdez, a forensic doctor in Mexico City, and in 20 years of my career, I have seen it all. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the case of the nameless man who arrived on my autopsy table on a cold November dawn. This guy had scars from expensive surgeries on his abdomen, hands as smooth as an office worker's, but calloused feet like those of a manual laborer. He wore brand-name clothes, but worn out to the point of looking like rags. And when we started investigating, every clue led us to two completely different people. It was as if two lives had inhabited the same body. Before starting, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can know how far it reached. It was 3 in the morning when they called me. A body had appeared in an alley near La Condesa. Nothing strange so far, but the detective in charge, a guy named Mendez whom I had worked with before, told me there was something strange. Very strange. I arrived at the morgue, and there he was. A man around 50 years old, well preserved, without identification. Cause of death, cranial trauma, apparently a robbery gone wrong. Routine, I thought. I was completely wrong. I started the external examination as usual. And that's when it all began. This man had a perfectly done appendectomy scar, probably from a top private hospital. He also had marks from a laparoscopic gallbladder surgery, a modern, expensive technique. His teeth showed high-quality dental work, veneers, implants, professional whitening. Everything pointed to someone with money, with access to luxury private medicine. But then I saw his feet, thick calluses, deformities from years of using cheap footwear, thickened nails with old, untreated fungal infections. His hands confused me even more. The palms were smooth, but the knuckles had old scars from repeated blows, like from street fights or hard labor. And on his lower back, whip marks. Old, very old, at least 20 or 25 years. I checked his clothes. Italian brand suit, but with at least 5 years of heavy use. The shoes were very expensive, Oxfords, but resold 3 times with cheap material. In the pockets, we found 300 pesos, a very worn religious image of St. Jude Thaddeus, and a wrinkled dry cleaning receipt from Polanco with a name, Alejandro Fuentes. We ran the name. Nothing. He didn't exist in any registry. No birth certificate, no voter ID, no CURP, nothing. As if the name were fake or made up. But the receipt was real. From 2 weeks ago. We called the dry cleaners. Yes, they knew a Mr. Alejandro who dropped off suits every 15 days, always paid in cash. Polite man, few words. I took fingerprints. We processed them. And here comes the truly inexplicable part. The prints matched a man named Roberto Salinas, reported missing 23 years ago in Monterrey. 23 years. This man had been dead on paper for more than 2 decades. We contacted the original family in Monterrey. An older sister, Mrs. Esperanza, agreed to come identify the body. When she arrived and saw him, she fainted. It was him. It was Roberto, her younger brother. She cried, saying he had come back, that after so long, he had returned, even if dead. She told me the story. Roberto Salinas had been a troubled youth. Drugs, bad company, debts. He disappeared at 26. The family thought he had been killed, fled, or went to the United States. They never knew. They filed a report, but in the 90s, things weren't followed up like they are now. He simply vanished, but the story didn't match what I was seeing. This body showed signs of having had access to luxury medical care in recent years. The surgeries were from 5, 7 years ago at most. The dental work was recent. This man had had money, quite a lot of money, at some point in his life. I started investigating more deeply. I analyzed his organs. The liver showed old damage compatible with past alcohol or drug use, but regenerated, a sign that he had quit those substances years ago. The lungs were clean. This guy had led a healthy life for at least the last decade. Then Mendez, the detective, found something. In the lining of the jacket, there was a business card hidden, sewn inside the fabric. It said Alejandro Montes, financial consultant, with an address in Santa Fe, the city's wealthy area. Another name, a third name for the same dead man. We went to the address. It was real, a corporate glass building. But the company had closed 3 years ago. We talked to the building manager. Yes, he remembered Alejandro Montes. Serious guy, professional, handled accounts for medium-sized companies. Always alone, never talked about his personal life. One day, he simply stopped coming and the office closed. We got access to tax records. Alejandro Montes had existed as a taxpayer for 12 years. He had paid taxes, had an RFC, everything in order. But the documents he used to register were fake. Well done, but fake. The timeline started to piece together in my head. Roberto Salinas disappears in Monterrey in '98. At some point between then and 2006, he becomes Alejandro Montes. He works, prospers, makes money. He has surgeries, fixes his teeth, dresses well. Then something happens in 2018. His business closes and he lives 3 more years as Alejandro Fuentes with fewer resources but still managing. But the key piece was missing. Why? What had happened in '98 for a drug addict from Monterrey to disappear and reappear as a financial consultant with a false identity? The answer came from the least expected place. One of the lab assistants, reviewing the belongings again, found something we had overlooked. In the hem of the pants, there was a small cut like it was made on purpose, and inside, a tiny folded piece of paper with a phone number and the words, "In case of emergency, Laura." We called the number. A woman answered, Laura Mireles. When we told her we had information about Alejandro Fuentes, she fell silent. Then, she asked if he was dead. We confirmed it. She came the next day. Laura was a woman about 45, elegant, professional. She sat in front of me and told me the whole truth. She and Roberto had met in '98 at a rehab center. Both were hitting rock bottom. They fell in love, supported each other, got better together. But Roberto was afraid. He had taken part in a robbery when he was young, in Monterrey. He hadn't killed anyone, but he had been there. He thought they were after him, that he'd go to jail. They decided to start over. With help from contacts Laura had, they got fake documents. Roberto Salinas died on paper. Alejandro Montes was born. They studied, prepared themselves, built a life. Roberto turned out to be brilliant with numbers, with finance. He created his consultancy. They did well for years, but they never married. Laura explained that Roberto never wanted to legally bind her to a lie. They lived together, but separated on paper. In 2018, Roberto had a crisis of conscience. He wanted to confess everything, come back, face what he had done. Laura tried to convince him that the statute of limitations had passed, that nothing would happen, but he couldn't live with the guilt. He closed his business. They separated, not for lack of love, but because Roberto sank into a deep depression. He wanted to disappear again, but for real this time. He became Alejandro Fuentes, a nobody, living on odd jobs, spending the savings he had left. Laura saw him occasionally, tried to help, but he sank deeper every time. The whip marks on his back, Laura told me, were from his childhood. He had grown up with a violent stepfather. That violence had led him to drugs, to bad decisions, and even though he had built a new life, he never really escaped who he was. The night he died, Roberto had called Laura. He told her he had finally made a decision. He was going to return to Monterrey, to turn himself in, to find his sister. He wanted to die being Roberto Salinas, not a ghost with fake names. He was walking to the bus station when he was robbed. A stupid coincidence. 3 guys who wanted his 300 pesos. He resisted, maybe out of old street instinct. They hit him in the head. He died in the alley. I officially closed the case as Roberto Salinas. His sister in Monterrey was finally able to bury him. Laura went to the funeral, from afar, without identifying herself. She told me afterward. She said Roberto deserved to rest with his real name, the one his mother gave him. This case marked me because it taught me something I sometimes forget in this job. I don't just examine bodies. I examine entire lives compressed into scars, into damaged and healed organs, into objects kept in pockets. Roberto was 3 men in 1. A lost youth, a successful professional, and a tormented soul seeking redemption. All 3 identities were real. All 3 were him. Since that day, every time an unidentified body arrives at my table, I take an extra moment. Because I know that behind every corpse are stories we never imagine, secrets people carry to the grave. And sometimes, just sometimes, those stories need to be told so that someone can finally rest in peace. I remember perfectly that November dawn when my phone rang. It was a Tuesday, around 4 in the morning, and the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a police officer I had known for years. They urgently needed me at the morgue. They had found a body under strange circumstances, and from the very beginning, something about the case didn't add up. When I arrived, the scene was baffling. The man had been found in an alley in the historic downtown area with no obvious signs of violence, but with a disturbing detail. He carried 2 different plain wallets in his pockets. In one were documents identifying him as Miguel Angel Cortez, a 42-year-old civil engineer, married, living in an upper-middle-class residential area. In the other wallet, the documents bore the name Antonio Ruiz, a 38-year-old construction worker, with an address in a poor neighborhood in the north of the city. The first thing I did was examine the body carefully. He was a man of robust build, with hands bearing the calluses typical of heavy manual labor. That matched more closely the profile of Antonio Ruiz than that of an office engineer. However, when I looked at his nails, they were perfectly cared for, uniformly trimmed, something unusual for a laborer. His teeth showed expensive dental work, porcelain crowns, professional whitening. That kind of dental care was not typical for someone with a construction worker's income. While taking photographs and notes, my assistant handed me the personal belongings collected at the scene. Besides the 2 wallets, there was a watch from a well-known brand, verified later to be genuine, valued at several $1,000s. But on the same wrist, marks from a cheap strap had left a different tan line, as if he habitually wore a much simpler watch. In his back pocket, we found crumpled receipts, some from exclusive restaurants with recent dates, others from convenience stores and popular eateries, all interspersed over time. I immediately requested a full toxicological analysis and began the autopsy. What I found inside deepened the mystery even more. His liver showed signs of regular alcohol consumption, but not destructive, rather social. His lungs were in good condition, with no traces of heavy smoking. But what truly puzzled me was discovering evidence of 2 previous surgeries. An appendectomy performed with first-rate surgical technique, precise sutures, and minimal scarring, and another operation on his right knee, which, according to bone healing patterns, had been done under much more precarious conditions, probably in a public hospital with limited resources. I contacted both families. Miguel Angel Cortez's wife arrived first, an elegant woman who broke down in tears upon seeing the body. She identified it without hesitation, mentioning a mole on his left shoulder and describing a scar on his back from a childhood fall. She was devastated and confused about what her husband was doing in that part of the city. She said he had left 3 days earlier for a supposed business trip to Guadalajara. 2 hours later, another woman came, of simpler appearance, accompanied by 2 small children. She introduced herself as Antonio Ruiz's partner. When I showed her the body, she also recognized it immediately. She pointed out the same mole, the same scar, but added details the first woman hadn't mentioned. A faded tattoo on the ankle that she said he had gotten in his youth before meeting her. The first wife had never mentioned that tattoo. That's when I understood that this was not a case of identity theft or false documents. This man had literally lived 2 parallel lives. I deepened the investigation along with the police team. We reviewed his bank transactions and discovered that Miguel Angel Cortez had an account with a considerable balance, regular salary deposits as an engineer at a major firm. But Antonio Ruiz also had an account, more modest, with weekly deposits matching daily wages on construction sites. We contacted his employer as an engineer. They confirmed he was an exemplary employee, regularly attending the office, managing important projects. Then we spoke with the foreman from the construction site where Antonio Ruiz supposedly worked. They also confirmed it. He was a reliable worker, strong, arriving early and leaving late. When comparing dates, we discovered something incredible. He worked in construction on weekends and specific days that he had reported as vacation or personal days in his engineering job. I examined his body again, this time looking for something specific. I found what I needed in his muscles. The musculature of his back and arms showed asymmetric development, exactly the pattern seen in people who do heavy physical labor regularly, but not continuously. His hands told the whole story. Calluses on the palms from carrying materials, but also ink stains on the right index finger, typical of someone who frequently writes and draws on plans. I interviewed friends and acquaintances of both identities. Miguel Angel's friends described him as an educated, cultured man who spoke about architecture and design and attended art exhibitions. Antonio's coworkers spoke of a simple guy who shared beers after work, joked, and talked about football. But when I asked for deeper descriptions, some traits coincided. Both were generous, private about their personal lives, never talking much about their past. The truth began to reveal itself when we found a small apartment rented under a third name, one that did not appear on any official documents. It was a tiny space, almost empty except for an old trunk. Inside were photographs, letters, diaries. That man had grown up in extreme poverty, worked in construction since childhood, but had extraordinary intelligence. He had studied at night, earned scholarships, completely reinvented himself. But something in him could not leave behind his roots, or perhaps he felt he had betrayed where he came from. We discovered that he supported his original family, Antonio's, with the money from his weekend job. And he had built a new life as Miguel Angel, remarrying, climbing the social ladder. It was neither schizophrenia nor dissociative identity disorder. It was something more complex, more human. He was a man trapped between two worlds, unable to abandon either, living a duality that eventually consumed him. The cause of death turned out to be a cerebral aneurysm, completely natural, ironic in its simplicity. But what we discovered afterward was the most disturbing. Neither family had any idea of the other's existence, and both had equal legal rights over him, his belongings, and his memory. The case took an even more bewildering turn when I decided to examine more deeply that secret apartment we had discovered. It was a space unknown to either family, a personal refuge that this man had kept hidden for years. I asked the lead detective to allow me to spend more time there. I needed to understand not only who this man was, but how he had managed to maintain this double existence without anyone suspecting. The trunk we had found contained much more than we initially reviewed. There were notebooks meticulously organized by date, starting almost 20 years ago. The earliest ones were simple, written in irregular, almost childish handwriting, where a young man barely 18 described his days in construction, carrying bags of cement, mixing concrete under the scorching sun. But even in those early pages, there was something different. Amid the descriptions of physical labor, there were mathematical calculations, geometry problems he posed to himself, drawings of structures with notes about material strength. In one of those old notebooks, I found a letter that was never sent, addressed to his deceased mother. In it, he promised her that he would rise out of poverty, that he would study, that he would become someone important. But he also promised he would never forget where he came from, that he would never abandon his family. That letter made me understand that what we were seeing was not the result of an impulsive decision or a calculated deception. It was the literal fulfillment of an impossible promise, an attempt to be two people because he felt he could not choose between his commitments. The later notebooks showed his transformation. He had managed to enroll in night classes, studying after full days of physical work. His grades were exceptional. I found course certificates, workshop diplomas, and finally, a full scholarship to study civil engineering at a public university. That was where the split began. In those notebooks, he started referring to himself in two different ways. In some entries, he signed as Antonio. In others, he began using the name Miguel Angel, the name of an uncle who had died when he was a child, and whom he deeply admired. What disturbed me most was discovering that this separation of identities was neither accidental nor the product of any mental disorder. It was deliberate, calculated, documented. He had created a complex system of calendars, color codes, reminders. He kept a meticulous record of what he had told each family, which events he had to remember, which details not to confuse. It was a surgical precision operation, executed over years with astonishing discipline. In one of the most recent notebooks, dated just 6 months before his death, I found an entry that chilled my blood. He wrote verbatim, "Every day it's harder to remember who I really am, or if there ever was a true self beyond these two masks I've built." Miguel Angel has everything Antonio dreamed of: respect, education, a nice house, a wife who has never known want. But Antonio has something Miguel Angel lost along the way: honesty, connection to the land, to real people. I can't kill either because both are real. Both have people who depend on them, who love them. I am condemned to be two halves that will never form a whole. Those words struck me deeply. We were not investigating a con artist or a conventional bigamist. This was a man trapped in an existential dilemma he had built himself, brick by brick, just like the structures he designed as an engineer and built as a laborer. I decided to delve into the finances because something didn't quite add up. If he maintained 2 families and 2 lives, the numbers had to be extraordinarily tight. What I discovered was even more revealing. As Miguel Angel Cortez, he earned a considerable salary as a senior engineer, but lived modestly, far below his means. His wife, whom I interviewed again, confirmed that he had always been frugal, saying they were saving for the future, for the education of the children they planned to have. The money he saved as Miguel Angel was transferred through a complex system of intermediary accounts to Antonio's family. But it didn't stop there. The money he earned on weekends as a construction worker, he saved almost entirely. We discovered a savings account with a significant amount and a will hidden in that secret apartment specifying that the money should be divided equally between both families in the event of his death. The man had even planned his own end, although he probably did not expect it to come so soon. He was only 42 years old in reality, although his documents as Antonio made him 4 years younger. That detail was also significant. He had rejuvenated Antonio's identity to make his physical condition, his capacity for heavy work, appear more plausible. When I interviewed his co-workers in both worlds with more specific questions, fascinating details emerged. At the engineering office, some colleagues mentioned that he occasionally used unexpected colloquial expressions, suddenly showing practical construction knowledge beyond theory. One engineer recalled once visiting a site where this man had taken a shovel to demonstrate the correct technique for mixing concrete with a familiarity that surprised everyone. On the other hand, on the construction site, the foreman remembered that Antonio sometimes made observations about the plans that revealed a sophisticated understanding of structural engineering. He once spotted an error in the design of a column that could have caused serious problems. When asked how he knew, he simply said he had worked many years and learned to see those things. Both identities seeped into each other, as if no matter how much he tried to keep them separate, they were fundamentally part of the same person, incapable of existing in completely sealed compartments. The detective in charge of the case asked me if we should classify him as a fraud. Technically, he had falsified documents, married twice without dissolving the first marriage, evaded certain legal obligations, but as I reviewed all the evidence, all the letters, all the diaries, I could not see him simply as a criminal. He was a man who had tried to fulfill incompatible promises, who wanted to be faithful to his past while building a future, and who paid the highest price. He had lived without ever being able to be completely himself at any time, in any place. What troubled me most was thinking about his last moments. When the aneurysm burst in his brain, when he fell in that alley in the historic downtown, halfway between both worlds, who did he think of? Was it Miguel Angel or Antonio who saw his life flash before his eyes? Or finally, in that last instant, did he simply manage to be himself, whole and unified, even if just for a second before it all ended? The autopsy had revealed that death was instantaneous, but that did not answer all my questions. I decided to investigate his last hours with an almost obsessive attention to detail. I needed to understand what had precisely led him to that alley at that specific moment. I reviewed the security camera footage from the historic center, tracking his movements throughout that final day. What I discovered left me speechless. That particular day was special for a reason neither family knew. It was the anniversary of the death of his mother, the woman to whom he had made that impossible promise 20 years earlier. He had requested the day off from the engineering office, something he rarely did. The cameras caught him early in the morning, visiting the cemetery alone, carrying modest flowers. He stayed there for almost 2 hours, sitting in front of the grave. Later, I saw him walking through the center, entering and exiting old churches, sitting on park benches, simply observing. In a cafe, the cameras showed him writing in one of his notebooks for over an hour. That notebook was never found. He probably had it with him when he died, and someone took it before we arrived. I would have liked to know what he wrote in those last reflections. But the most revealing came when I interviewed the owner of a small used bookstore downtown. He recognized the photograph immediately. That day, the man had entered his shop and spent hours browsing old books. Finally, he bought 2 poetry books, one by Pablo Neruda and another by Octavio Paz. The bookseller remembered the detail because he found it curious that he bought 2 copies of the same Neruda book. When asked if it was a gift, the man simply smiled and said they were for 2 very important people in his life. I contacted both families and asked if they had received any books recently. Miguel Angel's wife recalled that 3 days before his death, her husband had left a Neruda book on the bedside table with a note that read, "So you understand the silences I sometimes need." Antonio's partner confirmed something similar. He had given her an identical book 2 days before dying with a note that said, "So, you know I always think of you, even when I'm not here." This made me reflect on something I had overlooked until then. I went back to the secret apartment and searched more carefully. Behind an old wardrobe, I found a metal box containing photographs. They were not photographs of either family. They were photos of him alone in different places around the city. In parks, at viewpoints, in cafes, always alone. Some were selfies, others clearly taken with a timer. There were dozens of them, dated over the years. At first, I didn't understand the purpose of these photographs until I noticed something. In each one, he was dressed neutrally, neither like the engineer Miguel Angel nor the laborer Antonio. Casual, ordinary, anonymous clothes, and on his face was an expression that didn't appear in any of the family photos we had seen. It wasn't exactly happiness, but neither sadness. It was peace, or perhaps resignation, or maybe just the expression of someone who, for a moment, didn't have to pretend to be anyone other than himself. That secret apartment was not just a place to store documents and organize his double life. It was the only space where he could exist as a whole person, where Antonio and Miguel Angel fused into who he truly was. That's why there were engineering books alongside construction tools. That's why there were suits hanging next to cement-stained overalls. It wasn't disorder or contradiction. It was integration. I found something else that broke my heart. A recent letter, written just a week before his death, addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to himself. In it, he described a recurring dream he had. He dreamed of organizing a large dinner where he invited both Antonio's entire family and Miguel Angel's entire family, his engineer colleagues, and his construction coworkers. In the dream, everyone knew each other, everyone knew the whole truth, and instead of rejection or condemnation, there was understanding. Everyone understood that he had done what he believed was necessary, that he had genuinely loved all the people in his life, that it wasn't malice, but a desperate attempt to honor commitments he felt sacred. The letter ended saying, "I know that dream will never come true, that when the truth comes to light, there will only be pain and confusion. But I want to believe there is a version of this world where it is possible to be true to all parts of oneself without having to split until breaking." I shared some of these findings with the detective and the social worker who was Vince of To Our Half. Helping the families process the situation, we decided to do something unconventional. We organized a meeting with both families, not for confrontation, but to share the full story so they could see the notebooks, the letters, the photographs of that man alone in the city. We wanted them to understand that they had not been victims of a cruel deception, but unwitting participants in the tragedy of someone who tried the impossible. The meeting was devastating and cathartic at the same time. There were tears, disbelief, moments of anger, but there was also something unexpected. Miguel Angel's wife and Antonio's partner looked each other in the eyes and recognized something they shared. Not only having loved the same man, but having been genuinely loved by him, each in her own way. The children, though hurt and confused, began to understand that their father had not been a monster, but an extraordinarily complicated human being trapped in circumstances he himself had created but could no longer control. At the end of that meeting, something extraordinary happened. Antonio's mother, that elderly woman who had raised 5 children alone in extreme poverty, spoke for the first time. With tears running down her wrinkled face, she said something I will never forget. "My son tried to be 2 men because he thought one man was not enough to fulfill all the promises he had made. I taught him never to forget where he came from, but I never told him it was okay to dream of something better. That guilt is mine too." I left that meeting completely emotionally exhausted, but with a new clarity about the case. The days following the meeting between the families were strange for me. Technically, the case was closed from a forensic point of view. I had determined the cause of death, identified the body, and gathered all the pieces of the puzzle of his double identity. My superiors considered my work finished, but I couldn't let it go. There was something that still unsettled me. A persistent feeling that a crucial piece was missing in this whole story. I returned to the secret apartment for the 3rd time, this time completely alone, without a detective or authorities. I needed to be there unhurried, without pressure, just observing. I sat in that chair where he had probably spent so many hours organizing his fragmented life and simply looked around. That was when I noticed something that had gone unnoticed in previous searches. On one of the walls, there were pencil marks, barely visible, as if someone had written something and then tried to erase it unsuccessfully. I approached with a flashlight and was able to make out numbers. They were dates, many dates, written in columns. At first, they seemed random, but when I copied and analyzed them at home that night, I discovered a disturbing pattern. They were the dates of important events in both families: birthdays, anniversaries, children's school presentations, important dinners. But not only that, there were also dates that did not correspond to family events. They were dates when both identities had simultaneous commitments and he had to choose. Next to some dates, there were small marks, like check marks or crosses. The check marks indicated he had managed to fulfill both commitments. The crosses marked the times he had to fail one of the families. I counted the crosses. There were 27 occasions in 20 years where he had to disappoint someone he loved. And next to each cross, he had written initials, probably of the person affected by his absence. This led me to a devastating realization. He kept an exact record of every time his double life had caused pain. He was not a man who lived this situation lightly or without remorse. Every failure, every necessary lie, every lost moment was recorded as a self-inflicted wound. That wall was a silent confessional, a record of guilt that no one else would ever see. But there was something else on that wall. In the upper corner, written in different, more recent ink, there was a phrase that sent a chill down my spine. I can't keep choosing anymore. The date next to that phrase was 2 weeks before his death. I contacted the detective again and shared this finding. Together, we began to reconstruct his last 2 weeks in more detail than before. What we discovered completely changed my understanding of his death. It turned out that in those last weeks, both families had organized important events for the same date. Miguel Angel's eldest daughter was graduating from college, an achievement she had repeatedly said she wanted to celebrate with her father present. At the same time, Antonio's youngest son would have his first communion, an event his mother had planned for months and which had deep religious significance for her. According to the testimonies we collected later, he had desperately tried to get one of the two families to change the date. He told Miguel Angel's wife that he had an unavoidable work commitment. He told Antonio's partner that he had to travel for a family emergency, but neither gave in. The graduation was already scheduled by the university and could not be changed. The communion was reserved at the church months in advance, and all family members had already been invited. For the first time in 20 years, he was in a situation where there was no possible solution. He could not be in two places at once. He could not divide himself any further. And no matter which he chose, he would deeply betray people he loved. We found evidence that he had considered finally revealing the truth. On his computer at the secret apartment, there was a draft email, never sent, where he began explaining everything to his wife. He had written and deleted that email at least 15 times in 1 week, each version slightly different, searching for the right words that never came. The last draft ended mid-sentence. I know this will destroy everything we have built, but I can no pot longer. He never finished that sentence. He never sent that email. Instead, that day, his mother's death anniversary, the day he spent alone in the cemetery and walking through the city, I believe he came to a different conclusion. He did not go to the alley by chance that night. We reviewed the cameras more carefully and realized he had passed through that alley at least 3 times in the hours before his death, as if he was surveying the area, as if he was making a decision. The detective looked at me grimly when we reached the same conclusion at the same time. I asked him directly if he thought it had been suicide. He gave me an answer that made me rethink the entire case. He said that technically no, the official report would still indicate an accident, that there was no physical evidence of suicidal intent, but maybe there was something worse than suicide, something more subtle and tragic. Maybe he had simply stopped taking care of himself. Maybe that night, walking through that dark alley, he had turned off the hypervigilance that had kept him alive and hidden for 20 years. Maybe for the first time, he simply walked without planning every step, without calculating every risk, without thinking of the consequences. And in that moment of surrender, the universe made the decision he could not make. It wasn't that he wanted to die exactly. It was that he no longer had the energy to keep living that way. And in his deep exhaustion, in his silent surrender, he had allowed fate to choose for him. I spoke with a psychologist specializing in complex identity cases, and he explained something fascinating and terrible. He said that maintaining separate identities requires an extraordinary cognitive and emotional effort, like running a mental marathon every day without rest. Eventually, he explained, the person becomes so deeply exhausted that body and mind simply shut down, like an overloaded system that finally collapses. That was exactly what I saw in his last photographs, his last letters, in that phrase on the wall. It was not clinical depression in the traditional sense, it was something more specific. The existential exhaustion of someone who had been two people for so long that he had forgotten how to be one. I looked again at his body in my forensic photographs with this new perspective. All those small inconsistencies I had noticed at first, the mixed calluses, the marks of two different lives etched on a single body, I now saw as evidence of an internal war that had lasted 2 decades. His body literally showed the scars of trying to be two men at the same time. I decided to do something that was technically outside my jurisdiction as a forensic specialist. I asked for permission to speak again with both families, but this time separately, and with deeper questions about their behavior in those last weeks. What I discovered confirmed my darkest suspicions. Miguel Angel's wife told me that in the days before his death, he had been unusually affectionate. He had told her he loved her several times a day, which was not typical of him. He had hugged his children for longer than usual. One night, he had entered each of their rooms while they were sleeping and simply stayed there watching them for a long time. She had found him silently crying in their eldest daughter's room, looking at photographs from when she was a child. Antonio's partner told me something almost identical. In those same weeks, he had been exceptionally present. He had canceled work trips, something he never did. He had cooked each family member's favorite meals. One afternoon, he had taken his children to the park and played with them for hours, as if wanting to imprint every detail in his memory. He had told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and when she asked why he suddenly said that, he just replied that sometimes we don't appreciate what we have until it's too late. Both families had interpreted these behaviors as positive signs, as if he was finally prioritizing his family life over work. They didn't realize that he was actually saying goodbye. Perhaps not consciously, but his subconscious knew something was about to end. He was creating final memories, telling them everything they needed to know without being able to tell them the whole truth. I found something no one had noticed before. In the secret apartment, hidden inside an old book on the shelf, there were 2 letters. They were dated 3 days before his death, one addressed to each family. I read them with trembling hands. In the letter to Miguel Angel's family, he wrote about how every moment with them had been genuine, how his love for them had never been an act, how his daughter was his greatest pride and his other children, the reason he got up every morning. He apologized for his absences, for the little lies about work trips, for not being able to explain more. He ended by saying he hoped one day they could understand that sometimes love is not enough to solve the impossible situations we ourselves create. The letter to Antonio's family was devastatingly similar. It spoke of how meeting them had been a rebirth, how they had given him a second chance at happiness when he thought it was no longer possible. He described specific moments with each child, small details that showed how much attention he had paid to knowing them. He thanked his partner for showing him that love can come at the most unexpected moments. He also apologized, mentioned the inevitable absences, and ended with the same phrase about impossible situations. What broke me was realizing that the letters were almost identical, in essence, because his feelings were genuine toward both families. There wasn't one he loved more than the other. There wasn't one life that was real and the other fake. Both were completely real to him, and that was precisely the problem. He couldn't choose because choosing meant destroying a part of himself that was absolutely authentic. He never sent those letters. He had written them perhaps as a way to process what he was feeling, but in the end, he hid them. After consulting with the authorities and the psychologist, I made the hardest decision of my career. I decided those letters should never reach the families. They had suffered enough. The letters would only add more questions, more pain, more guilt. I kept them in the case file, sealed, with instructions that they should only be opened if one day someone from the family specifically asked if he had left anything written for them. To this day, no one has asked. I think both families preferred to remember him as he was with them, without complicating those memories further with the evidence of his divided life. It has been 3 years since I officially closed that case. The forensic report states accidental death by cranial trauma resulting from an assault in a public place. Technically, it's correct, but I know the truth is more complex, more tragic, more human than any report can capture. Sometimes I think about that wall with dates and crosses, that obsessive record of every moment he had to fail someone he loved. I wonder how much burden a person can carry before they simply can't anymore. I wonder at the exact moment he decided, consciously or unconsciously, that he could no longer keep choosing. What haunts me most is not the mystery of his double identity. I eventually understood that. What haunts me is the question of whether there could have been another way out. If at some point in those 20 years, if he had gathered the courage to tell the truth, could things have been different? Or would the truth have been equally destructive, just in a different way? I have talked to colleagues about this case, obviously without revealing identifiable details. Some say he was a selfish man who created his own hell. Others say he was someone trying to do his best in a situation impossible of his own making. I believe he was simply a human being trapped by the consequences of a decision he made long ago, a decision that probably once seemed manageable until it wasn't. This case fundamentally changed how I see my work. Before, I saw bodies and looked for causes of death. Now, I see whole lives, complete stories, contexts that completely transform the meaning of what I find on my autopsy table. Every body has secrets, but some secrets are so deep that they redefine everything we think we know about the human capacity for love, sacrifice, and silent suffering. Both families eventually moved on with their lives. I know from informal follow-ups that the children are growing well, that the mothers have found ways to explain their absence that bring them peace. For Miguel Angel's family, he was a devoted husband and father who died tragically. For Antonio's family, he was a loving partner whose life was cut far too short. Both versions are true, both are incomplete. I keep copies of those photographs of both families we found in the secret apartment in my office in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes, in particularly difficult cases, when I feel overwhelmed by the sadness of my profession, I look at them. They remind me that behind every death are complexities we will never fully understand, that the human heart is capable of holding contradictions that defy all logic. They also remind me of something darker, but perhaps more important. They remind me that we all carry secrets, that we all have versions of ourselves we show to different people, that we all juggle different roles and responsibilities. The difference is only one of degree. He took this to the absolute extreme, but in essence, we all understand that feeling of being divided between different versions of who we are or who we think we should be. His story taught me that sometimes tragedy doesn't come from making the wrong decision, but from reaching a point where no right decision exists. And it taught me that the human body, that object I study every day in my lab, is more than just organs and tissues. It is a map of all the lives we have lived, all the decisions we have made, all the love we have given, and all the pain we have carried. When I look at my own reflection now, I wonder what marks I carry that no one else can see, what contradictions I live that seem normal only because I haven't taken them as far as he did. And I wonder if maybe we are all, on some level, people with multiple identities, trying to be everything to everyone until one day we simply can't anymore. That is the real impact of this case. It didn't leave me with answers. It left me with questions that will apply to every life I examine from now on, including my own.